The quiet before the storm. The most dangerous man in the world was asleep when they came for him. There are moments in history that feel like the world just holds its breath. And this was one of those moments. It was the early hours of a cold February morning in 2026. Somewhere deep in the quiet hills of a small town called Santa Clara, nestled in the heart of Colombia, something extraordinary was unfolding. Soldiers moved silently through the darkness. Their boots barely made a sound. Everyone knew what was at stake. Everyone knew who they were coming for. His name was Rafael El Tigre Montoya. And for decades, that name had meant one thing: fear. El Tigre was the head of the Nueva Fuerza cartel, or the NFC, a criminal empire so powerful, so deeply rooted, that many people had stopped believing anyone could ever bring it down. The Colombian army, working alongside special forces and national intelligence, had been hunting this man for years. And on this particular night, after months of careful planning and with intelligence support quietly provided by Washington, they finally had him cornered. The raid happened fast. Cartel fighters inside the compound opened fire the moment they sensed danger. Shots rang out in the night air. 4 of El Tigre's men were killed in the firefight. Several others were wounded, including El Tigre himself. He was pulled out of that compound bleeding and broken. A helicopter rushed him to the capital, Bogotá. But he never made it to the hospital alive. Official sources confirmed it. Rafael El Tigre Montoya was dead. And just like that, the world that he had built around himself, the fear, the power, the control, began to crack. But what happened next is what I really want to tell you about. Because the story didn't end with his death. In many ways, that's exactly where it began. Within hours, the streets of Colombia started burning. Before we talk about what happened after his death, I think we need to understand who Rafael Montoya really was. Because people like him don't appear out of nowhere. There's always a story. There's always a beginning. Rafael was born in a poor village in the Córdoba region of Colombia. He grew up with very little, a humble home, a struggling family, and a world that didn't seem to offer much to a boy like him. What's interesting and deeply ironic is that as a young man, he actually worked in local law enforcement for a short time. He learned how the system worked. He learned its weaknesses. And later, he used every single one of those weaknesses against it. By the time the 1980s rolled around, Rafael had already drifted into the edges of organized crime. He was caught up with older, established groups, the kind of criminal networks that had been running drugs across the Americas for years. He was arrested in the United States in the 1990s on charges of heroin trafficking. He served time. He was deported back to Colombia. And that could have been the end of his story. But it wasn't. Around 2009, Rafael Montoya did something that very few people had the nerve or the vision to do. He co-founded his own cartel, the Nueva Fuerza cartel. And from the very beginning, this wasn't just another criminal gang. This was an organization, a business, a military operation. Under his leadership, the NFC expanded aggressively into cocaine, methamphetamine, and eventually fentanyl, the synthetic drug that has devastated communities on both sides of the world. The cartel used military-grade weapons. It flew drones with explosives attached. It fought wars with rival groups and with government forces. By 2026, the NFC was considered one of the most dangerous criminal organizations on Earth. The United States had placed a $15 million bounty on Rafael's head, one of the highest ever offered for a trafficking figure. And yet, he stayed free. For decades, he stayed free. That's the thing about men like him. They become symbols. And symbols are very, very hard to kill. Let me take you back to those final weeks before the raid. Because the operation that ended Rafael Montoya's life didn't happen by accident. It was the result of months, maybe years of quiet, painstaking intelligence work. Colombian security forces, working alongside American intelligence agencies, had been slowly closing the net around him. They tracked movements. They monitored communications. They followed people close to him, associates, allies, and, according to some reports, someone very close to him personally, a romantic partner whose movements gave authorities the thread they needed to pull. That thread led them to a private villa on the outskirts of Santa Clara. A place where El Tigre thought he was safe. A place no one was supposed to know about. He was wrong. In the pre-dawn hours of February 22nd, Colombian forces launched a coordinated assault. Special forces moved in from multiple directions. The compound's guards opened fire immediately, and a fierce gunfight broke out. Rocket launchers and armored vehicles were found on the property. The cartel was not just protecting a man, they were protecting an empire. When the smoke cleared, 4 cartel members lay dead on the ground. Others had been wounded or captured. And El Tigre himself, shot, bleeding, alive but barely, was airlifted out by helicopter toward the capital. He died before they reached Bogotá. Now, I want you to think about what this meant for just a moment. This was a man who had spent decades building a fortress around himself, of loyalty, of fear, of violence. And in one early morning raid, all of that came apart. The Colombian government announced his death publicly. And the world, at least part of it, let out a breath it had been holding for a very long time. But cartel organizations don't grieve quietly. They respond. I don't think anyone was fully prepared for what happened next. Even those who expected retaliation, even those who had planned for it, were shaken by the scale of what unfolded across Colombia in the hours and days after Rafael Montoya's death was announced. It started almost immediately. Within minutes of the news breaking, cartel loyalists across the country began mobilizing. It was coordinated. It was intentional. And it was terrifying. In at least 20 of Colombia's departments, cartel members set up what they call narcobloqueos, roadblocks made of burning vehicles, stretching across major highways and city routes. Buses were set on fire. Petrol stations were torched. Banks, shops, and businesses in affected areas were attacked. Entire neighborhoods went quiet as residents locked their doors and stayed inside. The violence spread to more than 20 regions, including Antioquia, Nariño, Valle del Cauca, Santander, and Bolívar. More than 70 people lost their lives in the chaos that followed. Among the dead were cartel members, security forces personnel, and, heartbreakingly, at least one civilian who simply happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Prisons were targeted. Cartel members attempted to break incarcerated associates free from detention facilities. It was a statement, a declaration that the organization was still alive, still powerful, still dangerous. Schools were closed. Public transport was suspended in major cities including Medellin and Cali. Airlines began canceling and rerouting flights. Foreign governments, including the United States, Canada, and Australia, issued urgent travel advisories telling their citizens to stay indoors, to shelter in place, to wait. People were scared. And honestly, I understand why. Because this is the thing that doesn't always make the news. Behind every statistic, behind every burning vehicle and every broken window, there are real people. Mothers who couldn't get their children to safety. Shopkeepers watching everything they'd built go up in flames. Ordinary families caught in the middle of something that had nothing to do with them. That's what violence like this really costs. Not just lives. Not just property. It costs people their sense of safety. And once that's gone, it's very hard to get back. And so here we are. The dust has started to settle, at least a little. More than 10,000 soldiers and National Guard personnel were deployed across Colombia to restore order. Within 24 hours, authorities had cleared over 250 roadblocks. Arrests were made. The government declared that the situation was stabilizing. President Elena Vargas and Security Minister Diego Castano stood before the cameras and told the country that the forces of order had prevailed, that the nation would not be held hostage by criminal organizations, that justice had been served. And in some ways, they were right. Rafael El Tigre Montoya, a man who had evaded capture for decades, who had built one of the most powerful criminal empires in South American history, was gone. That matters. It really does. But here is where I want to leave you with something honest. Something real. The death of one man, even a man as powerful as El Tigre, does not dismantle a cartel. It doesn't heal the communities that were devastated by decades of drug violence. It doesn't bring back the people who were lost. And in many cases, what follows the death of a powerful leader is not peace, it's a power struggle. And power struggles in the criminal world are rarely quiet. El Tigre's son, the one widely expected to take over the NFC, was already sitting in a prison cell in the United States. That left a vacuum. And vacuums, in the world of organized crime, always get filled, one way or another. Security analysts warned that without central leadership, the cartel could fragment. Different commanders fighting for control. More violence. More instability. Not less. There were also bigger questions that lingered. Colombia was preparing to host major international sporting events in the coming years, and the world was watching. Investors, tourists, diplomats, all of them paying attention to whether this country could hold itself together. And then there was the deeper question, the one that never really goes away. Does eliminating a leader actually solve anything? Or does it just reshape the problem into something harder to see? I don't have a perfect answer to that. I'm not sure anyone does. What I do know is this. The people of Colombia, like people everywhere who live under the shadow of this kind of violence, deserve more than just the removal of one man. They deserve safety. They deserve stability. They deserve a future where their children don't grow up afraid. That's not something a single raid in the early morning hours can give them. It takes something much longer, much harder, and much more sustained than that. But maybe, just maybe, it's a start. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to follow for more.